G'day everyone and welcome back to Home Group Help. It's study 10 in our series in 1 Samuel. We've had a break for the school holidays looking at the bonus study on spirits and the occult. This week Chris has preached from Psalm 73 and so there's a great opportunity for thinking through, are we envying people who haven't understood the big picture, that don't realise that God is in control of all things and that we need to be on God's side if we're going to be on the winning side? Are we chasing after things that the world chases after rather than actually understanding what life is all about in light of God? So it's a great opportunity to spend some time thinking about those things, praying for one another in the midst of that, and being an encouragement to one another to keep our eyes on Jesus. We've got a home group huddle. Obviously, we're coming towards the end of our series. We've got this study, we've got the next study, and then we'll be starting a new series on conversations that matter, thinking about how we get to the gospel, how the gospel applies to some of the big issues that are being talked about by our non-Christian friends. And so we're looking at Tuesday the 23rd of July from 7:30 to 9 p.m. So lock that one away in your calendar. More details to follow in the coming days. The big question for this week's study is this interaction between obeying God and wisdom. How do we think through things? How do we make decisions when sometimes God hasn't made it clear exactly what we should be doing? In the midst of a situation, a complicated situation, when we're not exactly sure what we should be doing, how do we know when we're just following our own ways, when we're following God's ways? It's quite a complicated set of passages. And there's no easy answers, and so there's a little bit of debate in the people who've written on these chapters, working out whether what David's doing here is the right thing or not. So question 1 Samuel 27, 1-7. Up until now, David has explicitly asked God what to do. He speaks to God directly. He speaks to God through the prophet or the priest. But here, there's nothing explicitly said about him going back to Gath. He's been to Gath, the hometown of Goliath, back in chapter 21. Then he acted like a madman so that he could escape. This time it's different. He goes up with his men, 400 men. They're going out on attacks from Gath. But I guess the big issue is that there's nothing that tells him to do this. This is him using his wisdom. How do I flee from Saul? I'll go to the place where Saul's least likely to go on the attack into Philistine territory. And so there's a question there already being raised. Is David doing the right thing by going up there? Which leads into that second question. Get half of your group to argue for what David's doing here is the right thing to do. He's actually doing what God would have him do. Get the other half of the Bible study to be thinking through or arguing for, no, what David's doing here is wrong. He's just trusting in himself rather than trusting in God. It's a really complicated passage and there's no really easy answer. And so have a gentle debate. Don't be arguing definitively, this is right, this is wrong, and you've got to believe what I believe, otherwise you're incorrect. I don't think that the text gives us sufficient justification to be able to come down hard one way or the other. Some of the issues that come up, while based in Gath, what does David do that's consistent with God's explicit command? Well, he's going out on the attack, right back from the time of Moses, handing on to Joshua. Clearly God's people are to go into the land and to get rid of the people who are living in the promised land. It's a judgment against them for their wickedness. And Israel needs to obey completely by destroying them. If they keep people alive, then it's an incomplete obedience of God. And so David going around and destroying people completely, potentially is David doing what the king should be doing. King Saul, the anointed one, whom the Spirit of God has left, is chasing David. He should be doing something else. He should be not chasing after a fellow Israelite. He should be chasing enemies or killing enemies who are living in the promised land. But instead he's wasting time doing that which he shouldn't be doing. David, as the anointed one, though he's not king yet, is already behaving as a king. He's doing that which the leader of God's people is supposed to be doing. But how he does that, strange. What is David's relationship with his enemy, the Philistines? Well, he acts like their friend. He presents himself to the leaders of the Philistines as someone who's trustworthy, as somebody who's fighting for them. But he's fostering this relationship in order to keep Saul at bay. Saul's been chasing him potentially now for a number of years, and this is his way of gaining his security. And yet, the question there is David being deceitful? Is he being a liar as he goes about actually killing different people, wiping them out completely so that they don't come back and tell on David and his men? And so it's quite a complicated thing. There is a precedent, obviously, with the Hebrew midwives when they're down in Egypt. They lie directly to Pharaoh, saying that the Israelite women give birth before we can get there. It's very unlikely that that's actually a true statement, and God blesses them for looking after his people. And so potentially, again, what David's doing here is looking after God's people, and therefore there's some justification for the way that he goes about that. Again, this comes back to your debate. Is it the right thing? Is it the wrong thing? Well, the author here, the narrator, is not giving us God's thoughts on whether it's right or wrong, and so it's very difficult for us to judge conclusively. In chapter 8, the Philistines go to war with Saul against Israel, and Saul rightly recognises that God has stopped speaking to him. As the king, he's going out as a representative of God's people, and therefore he needs to hear from God what he should be doing. And yet, because Saul was disobedient repetitively, God's withdrawn from Saul and will not speak with him. Which leads into this next strange incident. Why does Saul resort to going to this witch of Endor? He's consulting the dead because he finds that there's no other way to get in touch with God. Saul himself has killed the priests. When David fled, the priest was the person whom David approached, and in response Saul kills them without actually finding out whether the priests were helping David or not. And yet Saul's obviously at his wit's end. He doesn't know what to do. And so he resorts to this very wicked behaviour. It's been outlawed in Deuteronomy 8, 9 to 13. This behaviour of consulting spirits, of seeking out witches or mediums, is a terrible practice, which is part of the reason that the Canaanites have been condemned, for which the judgment is that the Israelites come into the promised land and wipe them out. And so the king of Israel is now doing the practices that the people who had been living in Canaan were doing and were judged for. And so Saul has very clearly become an enemy of God, and God is not going to speak to him because it's such a wicked behaviour. 1 Samuel chapter 29, verses 1 to 5. The commanders of the Philistines are opposed to David's presence because they're worried that he's going to be a double agent that turns now back to his original master, King Saul. He was an Israelite. He was a great one of the Israelites, as they know, having lived at Gath, the hometown of Goliath. And so they're worried that in the battle, David will turn back and join the Israelites again, and so they will be destroyed by David. The song in verse 5 was first sung after the defeat of Goliath, repeated in chapter 21 of 11. It relates to Hannah's song, which we said at the very beginning of our series would have the themes contained in it, which will be developed later on in the book. And here, as we're coming to the end of the book, we see that God has exalted the horn of his anointed one. David is already known, not just within the Israelites, but even amongst the Israelites' enemies, as this is the next anointed one. This is the one who will be king. And so its repetition shows that this is not something that's coming about because of David himself. David is being exalted to this position because God is behind it. God is the one who's exalting David. Now in 1 Samuel 29 verses 6 to 11, David could have insisted and perhaps even fought to go into battle alongside of the Philistines, but he submits to this wisdom of the Philistine leaders. The Philistine leaders are not stupid. It's actually tactically quite a sensible conclusion to come to. David himself seems quite intent on going up to fight, and yet at this point in time, he holds his plans loosely enough that when this decision is made against him, he abides by it and returns back home. What we see in hindsight is that God actually uses this to get David out of the battle so that David doesn't have to raise his hand against Saul, which is something that David has never wanted to do and has consistently said that that's what he will not do. And so David is removed from the battle by God. The chapters could be taken as either a positive or a negative portrayal of David, but David's interaction with God's enemies is fundamentally different to Saul's. David is always trying to obey God. When he has plans, he holds them loosely enough that if God changes things or if David's done something wrong, when he's confronted with his sin, he always responds with repentance. He always turns back to trusting in God. When Saul is confronted, Saul tries to make excuses. Saul asks Samuel to come back up with him so that he'll appear good before the eyes of the elders. And so Saul, when confronted with his wickedness, continues on in it. Whenever David's confronted with his wickedness, he turns from it and asks for forgiveness. Again, in interpreting these passages, we want to see how the Old Testament is preparing us for Jesus. And in a very complicated passage, there's still some things that are going on. One of the possibilities is that David's closest enemies are those who should understand exactly who he is, his own people. He's going and living with his enemies and he's somewhat safer there, whereas Jesus, when he's with those who are closest to him that should understand who he is, the Israelite religious leaders, they are the ones who are most strongly opposed to him and seeking to kill him. David doesn't raise his hand against his opposition in terms of Saul and the army. Likewise, Jesus won't raise his hand against the Israelite leaders, but will sacrifice his life. But I think the thing that is most clear is David's obedience to God. When he's confronted with what he should be doing, his immediate response is always to do that. And while we've got questions about David's motivation, has he done it wholeheartedly? Has he done it completely? With Jesus, we know that there's no doubts whatsoever. He obeys completely. There's never any disobedience. He trusts in his Father and does exactly what he is required to do. And so even in this complicated situation, there's a demonstration to us of trusting in God. It's right and appropriate to use our wisdom to be making thoughtful decisions about what's best in this situation. Sometimes God won't tell us explicitly what we should do. And yet, if we hold our plans loosely and keep trusting in God, allowing him to turn us, then that seems to be the right and appropriate response in these various situations. Again, we want you to be spending time in prayer for one another, for those that we know that still don't trust in Jesus. Obviously, the series is coming up where we're going to be seeking to answer some of the big questions that are being raised in our society at this time. Be praying for people that we know that we'd be able to have the appropriate time to be able to invite them along to the sermons that are most in line with the questions that they have. Keep praying with regards to those that have been in contact. We had the door knocking on Wednesday this last week, and just a follow up for that as well. Again, if you've got any questions, do feel free to get in contact. Sorry that this video was so late, had some problems with my computer, but look forward to meeting up with you again via video and then in a couple of weeks' time in person at Home Group Huddle. See you then. Bye.